Hello and welcome to the series I'll be calling the Shrink Ray Challenge. The aim of this challenge is to try and redraw pixel art at smaller scales while still retaining the key features of the artwork. The smallest image should still be recognizable as what I was trying to draw in the first place. In today's episode, I will be attempting to draw a lighthouse at 64 by 64, 48 by 48, 32 by 32, 16 by 16, and 8 by 8 pixels. Starting with the 64 by 64 canvas, I built up the base of the lighthouse. From there, I framed the main section of the structure and quickly realized the lighthouse was going to be very short due to the square shape of the canvas. I then worked on the coloring and shading, adding rivets to give the sides an industrial feel. I added some windows and drew in some algae at the bottom. After that, I worked on the top part of the lighthouse and sketched in a railing. At first I gave the casing around the light a red paint job, but later I decided on a plain grey. The roof was pretty easy going, but the height limit was very restricting. Once the lighthouse was complete enough for now, I worked on placing in some rocks. I switched out the casing for dark grey, added more rocks, and by then I was ready to add a background. Drawing the background went by quickly, and I placed in some birds, trying to use the shades of blue to simulate distance between them. As an afterthought, I made a little wooden pole with a lifebuoy, and with that, the 64 by 64 drawing was done. Now was the next size down, 48 by 48 pixels. I started with the base again and repeated the process. Because there isn't much difference between 48 and 64, I could keep a lot of the details. Working through the second drawing, I still felt some of the restrictions starting to affect the illustration. The main struggle was around the roof of the lighthouse, which ended up being a little shallower than the first. Where the drawing began to fall apart was around the lifebuoy, as the lower resolution made it harder to see what it was. Apart from that though, I was pretty happy with the final result. From there, it was onto the 32 by 32 pixel drawing, and as always, I started at the base. At this small scale, the angle of the sides became more difficult to draw. I managed to approximate it with a 1 pixel step on both sides. 32 pixels seemed to be the last comfortable stage, and while I couldn't get the rivets in, I still had the windows. I added some rocks, sea, and background. Then the third drawing was done. Now this is where the challenge becomes really difficult. All the drawings were approximated along the way, and 16 by 16 pixels was no exception. A lot of sacrifices were made, and I had to eliminate most of the original details. I think this one was my least favorite because the shape of the lighthouse wasn't quite right. Something that is interesting to point out though, is that each bird at this size was only 1 pixel. And finally, the 8 by 8 pixel drawing. This one was so tiny and probably the hardest to draw. Here, each pixel means so much more. In fact, for every pixel on the 8 by 8, there were 64 pixels on the largest drawing, meaning that 64 of those little drawings could fit on one large drawing. Whilst it was the most difficult to decide where to place my limited number of pixels, it was by far the fastest to create. Let's take a look at the final drawings. These are so much fun to make, and even though there are some things I would change about each drawing, I'm still pretty happy with the end result. I think it's clear that the limit is the 32 by 32 canvas, and past that, it's difficult to see what the drawing is. Thanks so much for joining me today as I experimented with how far this lighthouse illustration could go, and I'll see you in the next video.